Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you're digging these deep dives, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ding that bell so you don't miss out on future episodes. Today we're going to be looking at something that's not just history. It's actually surprisingly relevant to the world we live in right now. We're talking about the non-aligned movement, or NA. Now, whether you're a UPSC aspirant getting a head start on international relations, a student of history, or just someone who's curious about how global power dynamics work, this deep dive is for you.
You know what's really interesting about NAM is that it challenges the idea that you have to pick a side. Like, imagine the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union. They're like two giant magnets, right? Trying to pull every other country into their orbit. But NAM was this group of nations that were basically like, nope, we're going to create our own space.
I love that analogy. So our source material today is a super detailed document on NAM. And we're going to unpack its origins, its key principles, how it did during the Cold War, and if it even matters in our modern world. It's a journey that starts way back in 1955 with the Bandung Conference in Indonesia.
Yeah, this conference was like a pivotal moment. You had leaders from all across Asia and Africa, many of who had just gotten rid of colonial rule, and they were really looking to define their place in a world that was dominated by these two superpowers.
And out of this conference came some figures that we now consider the founding fathers of NAM. You've got Tigo from Yugoslavia, Nehru from India, Nasser from Egypt, and Nkrumah from Ghana, and Sukarno, the host himself, from Indonesia. And what's really interesting is this wasn't just some kind of anti-West club.
Exactly. These leaders weren't united by like a shared enemy, but by a shared desire for autonomy. They really believed in carving out a space where they could go after their own national interests without becoming pawns in the Cold War chess game.
So their main goal was to avoid getting caught up in those Cold War alliances. If you wanted to be a part of NAM, you couldn't be a member of groups like NATO. But it wasn't just about what NAM was against. It also stood for some pretty powerful principles.
Yeah, that's a really important point. NAM wasn't passive. It was actively pushing for things like respect for national sovereignty. I mean, think about it. These countries had just fought for their independence. They weren't about to let anyone else tell them what to do.
And peaceful resolution of conflicts was a big one. Like war wasn't the answer. They also believed in non-interference in each other's internal matters. You run your country your way, we'll run ours. And finally, promoting multilateralism, which is basically working together through organizations like the UN to solve problems.
And you know what's amazing is how these principles that came out of the Cold War, they still resonate today. In a world that's dealing with things like the rise of China, climate change, global pandemics, these ideas of cooperation and respecting sovereignty, they're super relevant.
It's like NAM was ahead of its time in a way. But let's be real. NAM's record during the Cold War itself was kind of a mixed bag. I mean, it did some good things, right?
Absolutely. NAM played a big part in supporting decolonization movements across the globe. It was a vocal advocate for putting an end to apartheid in South Africa, and it consistently pushed for global nuclear disarmament.
So it wasn't just talk. They were really pushing for change on the things that mattered. But there were some pretty big failures too, weren't there?
Unfortunately, yes. One of NAM's major weaknesses was that it couldn't prevent conflicts between its own members, like the wars between India and Pakistan. They really exposed the limits of the movement's commitment to peaceful resolution.
It's almost as if they could all agree on the big principles, but struggled when it came to actually sorting out real disputes. And speaking of India, its relationship with NAM is especially interesting, isn't it?
It really is. India was a founding member and a leading voice in NAM, championing its principles on the world stage. But things got a bit complicated when India started leaning towards the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
Oh, right. Some people saw that as going against the whole non-alignment idea. I mean, how can you really be non-aligned if you're getting all buddy-buddy with one of the superpowers?
Well, it really highlights the complexities of realpolitik. India, facing its own security concerns, especially from China, felt like it needed that Soviet support. And this whole balancing act between the ideals of non-alignment and the realities of national interest. It continued even after the Cold War ended.
It's like India was trying to have it both ways, sticking with NA in principle, but making strategic decisions that sometimes went against that principle. And this tension eventually led to a pretty big moment in 2016.
Yeah. When India's prime minister decided to skip the NAM summit, it sent a clear message that, at least for India, the movement wasn't a top priority anymore.
So with the Cold War over and a new world order coming up, was NA just destined to become irrelevant?
Welcome back to our deep dive into the non-aligned movement. So as we were saying, with the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of people started wondering, did N just outlive its purpose?
Yeah, like, if it was just a reaction to the Cold War, wouldn't it kind of become meaningless in a world with just one superpower? It's a question that's caused a lot of debate, right?
Oh, absolutely. Those who say NMM is outdated, they point to the fact that it's been struggling. In a world that's way more interconnected now, they say it doesn't have the unity or the resources to really tackle the global challenges we face today.
So they see it as this relic of the past, sort of like a talking shop, where countries just make statements, but don't actually get much done. It's all symbolism and no substance.
That's a pretty common criticism, yeah. They also say that. This whole idea of non-alignment is kind of outdated in itself, like in a globalized world where economies and security issues are all tied together, it's just impossible to stay truly neutral. You have to choose sides, form alliances, make strategic choices.
It's like trying to stay out of a group chat where everyone else is arguing. Eventually, you're going to get pulled in, right? So,
The people who think NM still matters, they have some pretty strong counterarguments. Oh, they definitely do. They argue that NAM's core principles, things like independence, multilateralism,
Yeah.
peaceful resolution, they say those are actually even more important now than ever.
so even though the Cold War context is gone, those values are still relevant?
Precisely. They see NM as a platform for developing countries, the global south, to push back against the dominance of the big players, to advocate for a fairer world order where their voices are actually heard and their interests are respected.
So it's like they're banding together for leverage. Instead of each country going it alone, they can amplify their influence by working as a group.
Exactly. And that's where this whole idea of strategic autonomy comes in. It's not about being passive or isolationist. It's about choosing your own path, forming partnerships that are based on shared interests, not because you're forced into one camp or another.
I'm starting to see how that could be appealing, especially for countries that don't want to be bossed around by bigger powers.
That's the big draw for a lot of NA members. They see it as a way to resist pressure from countries like the US or China to chart their own course in a multipolar world where there isn't just one dominant force.
It's a compelling argument. But let's be realistic. NAM does have a history of internal divisions, of struggling to put those lofty principles into action. Can they actually overcome these challenges?
That's the big question, isn't it? NAM's success really depends on its ability to address its weaknesses, to bridge those internal gaps, and actually deliver for its members.
So what would that look like in reality? What are some concrete things NAM could do to become more effective?
Well, one area is economic cooperation. NAM has realized that. If they want to have real influence globally, they need to address the economic disparities that exist within their own ranks.
It's like they're recognizing that. Political solidarity is great. But if your members are struggling financially, you're not going to get very far.
Precisely. So they've been pushing for stronger South-South cooperation, promoting trade and investment among developing countries, sharing technology and knowledge.
So it's about supporting each other, creating a more level playing field. What about other global issues, though, like climate change or access to healthcare?
Those are crucial areas where NM can and should be speaking up more. A lot of their members are on the front lines of climate change, dealing with rising sea levels, extreme weather, and food insecurity.
It makes sense for them to push for more help from richer countries to help them adapt and move towards cleaner energy.
For sure, and on healthcare. Especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, NM has been advocating for more equitable access to vaccines and medications. They're calling for a global health system that doesn't leave developing countries behind.
So instead of just reacting to crises, they're trying to be proactive and shape a more just and equitable world. But is that enough to make NAM truly relevant in the 21st century? Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So we've been talking about the non-aligned movement, and it seems like NAM is kind of at a crossroads right now. It's trying to reinvent itself for a world that's totally different from what it first started.
Yeah, for sure. The big question now is, what's next for NAM? Will it just fade away? Or can it actually become a major player in shaping a new world order?
It feels like there are a few different ways things could go. What are some of the possible scenarios we might see?
Well, one scenario is that NAM just keeps going as it is, struggling with its internal divisions and not really making much of an impact on the global scene.
So it basically becomes like a symbolic club where countries can air their grievances, but that's about it.
Right. They might still have their declarations and summits, but without any concrete action plans. and a stronger commitment from its members, it's unlikely to achieve a whole lot.
Okay. But what about a more positive scenario? What if NA actually manages to reform itself, to become a more united and effective force for the Global South?
Well, that's definitely the hope, but it would require some big changes. NAM would need to figure out a clearer way of making decisions, move away from just relying on consensus, and find ways to hold its members accountable for the promises they make.
So it's like going from a loose group to a more organized and disciplined one with a shared vision and the ability to actually get things done.
Exactly. A revitalized NAM could then focus on specific things where it can really make a difference, like promoting sustainable development, pushing for a fairer global trade system, or advocating for changes in international financial institutions.
Now that sounds like an NAM with a real purpose, but is there also like a less optimistic scenario? Could NAM actually break apart and fall apart completely?
That's a real possibility, unfortunately. We're already seeing some of that happening, with some members getting closer to China, while others are trying to counter China's influence by teaming up with the U.S. or other powers.
So instead of being united, NAM could become more and more divided, with its members just looking out for themselves.
Yeah, pretty much. And this whole trend of fragmentation could be made even worse by the rise of regionalism. A lot of countries are finding it more practical to focus on working with their neighbors, forming regional groups to tackle common problems.
So instead of looking to NAM for answers, they're turning inward, prioritizing regional cooperation.
Right, and that trend could make NAM even less relevant on the world stage.
So we've got these different possibilities. NAM could just keep muddling along, it could reinvent itself and become stronger, or it could completely fracture and disappear, based on what you know. Which path do you think is most likely?
Well,
honestly, it's tough to say for sure. But one thing's clear, NAM is at a make-or-break point. If it wants to survive and thrive in this century, it needs to adapt, show its members why it's valuable, and prove that it can actually make a positive difference in the world.
it's a crucial moment for the non-aligned movement. We'll deep divers. We've explored the history of NAM, its main principles, how it's changed over time, and the challenges it faces in a world that's constantly changing.
And as we've seen, NAM's future is still uncertain. It's up to its members to decide whether they want to revitalize this movement or let it become a thing of the past. And that's all the time we have for this deep dive into the non-aligned movement. We hope you found it informative and maybe even got you thinking a little bit. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our future episodes. Until next time, keep survoiding, keep learning, and keep diving deep.